So in this discussion, we are going to focus on measurements. Remember, physics can also be called as being a science of measurements. Why? Because we do a lot of measurements in physics. So we observe, we make measurements, and we make prediction based on the observation and measurements that we have carried out. So therefore, in physics, there's what we call as being, physical. So they are what we call as being physical quantities. Physical quantity. Now, what exactly is a physical quantity? Well, a physical quantity, we can say, is a quantity that can be measured, or we can simply say they are properties of matter that can be measured. So we can simply say that, these are quantities. So we can simply say these are quantities, that can be measured. So these are quantities that can be measured and expressed with a numerical. So expressed with a numerical value and a unit. That is what you can simply say. So the key word there is that you are able to measure them. They can be measured. So that is what we simply call as being physical quantities. So they are able to be measured. So there are a lot of physical quantities that we can talk about that can actually be measured. For example, when I talk about some of the physical quantities that can be measured, these may include what we are calling as being length. That can be measured. We can talk about velocity of an object. We can talk about acceleration of an object. We can talk about force. We can simply talk about time, pressure, mass, density, etc., etc. All these, as long as you are able to measure a physical quantity, you are able to measure, the property of matter, then we call that one as being a physical quantity. But I want to give you a roadmap when it comes to what we are calling as being physical, quantities. We can classify them further into, two categories. So they are what we simply call as being, basic. Sometimes they use the word in some other books, base, or they can use the word fundamental quantities. So they're what we call as being basic or base or fundamental quantity. And then we also have what we simply call as being derived, quantities. So that is what derived quantity. So that is what you need to remember. So physical quantities, all those that can be measured, can be further be categorized into two sections. What we are calling as being basic of base, fundamental. Please, you can just use one. You can call them as either basic quantities, or you can call them base quantity, or fundamental quantity is one and the same, and derived quantity. Now, what exactly are basic fundamental quantities that we are talking about? So let's briefly start with that one. So let me talk about what we are calling as being fundamental, sometimes as we are calling them basic quantity. What are these quantities? Please understand, pay attention, because this is the foundation that you're going to be using. So when we talk about fundamental quantities, we can say that these are the elementary. So we can say these are the elementary quantities. So these are the elementary quantity. These are the elementary quantities which covers the entire span of physics. In other words, I'm simply saying that when I talk about fundamental quantities, these are quantities that we choose not to express in terms of other quantities. So these are quantities that we choose not to express in terms of other quantities. That's the way you can also actually get to define them. And basically, when we talk about fundamental quantities, at our level here, we are just going to focus on what we are calling as being 7. So we are going to focus on 7, just 7 fundamental quantities. So 7 fundamental. So we are just going to look at 7 fundamental quantities. So I'm going to give you what we call as being the SI unit. So let me just try to put up a table that is actually going to help you. So in this direction, I'm going to put up the physical. So I'm going to put up what I'm calling as being the physical quantity that we are talking about. Then we are also going to, apart from the physical quantity this side, we are going to look at what we are calling as being the SI unit. So the word SI unit there stands for what we are calling as being international system of units. So international system unit, so SI unit. Then possibly in the far end there we can look at what is the symbol that is going to be used for that particular SI unit. So that is what we are going to look at. So the first one that I can actually start with is what we call as being length. So length is a physical quantity. Of course, it may refer to distance, height, and the like. All those are physical quantities that we're talking about. It is a fundamental quantity. What is the SI unit that we use? SI units are simply units that are recognized the world all over. Scientists came up and said, okay, let's make these to be elementary units from which other units can be obtained. And in terms of length, the SI unit is simply the meters. The symbol, we use small letter m. That's what you need to remember. The second one, we can simply talk about time. So when we talk about time, of course, time can be measured in a lot of units. There are days, hours, minutes, time, years, and so on and so forth. But the SI unit that we use is simply, seconds, and we use small letter s for time. The other one that we do have is what we call as being, mass. Mass is another, fundamental quantity that you need to remember. This one, there are so many units. For example, milligrams, kilograms, grams, centigrams, and so on and so forth. But the SI unit is simply the kilogram. So we use, that is the symbol that we are going to be using. The fourth one that you can simply talk about, and the fourth one that we can simply talk about apart from that is what we simply call as being, electrical, current. So we can talk about electrical current. So now when it comes to electrical current, we use what we call as being the ampere or ampere. That's what we use. It is represented by a capital symbol, A there. So that is what you need to remember when it comes to that unit. There are others, like I said, there are about 7, so we can look at the fifth one there. So I've talked about so far length, time, mass. We can talk about electrical current. Then we can also talk about what we are calling as being temperature. So temperature is another fundamental or basic quantity that we do have. Of course, you know that temperature can be measured in a lot of units, but what is the SI unit that is recognized the world all over? Well, for this one, the SI unit that is actually recognized, Fahrenheit, degrees, Kelvin, but the SI unit is simply the kelvins, so represented by K there. All right. Another one that we do have is what we call as being, luminous So we can talk about luminous intensity. So when we talk about luminous intensity, for example, when you look at a projector, how much light is coming from that projector? If it's a candle, how much light is coming from that one? The SI unit that we use is candela. Yeah, so it's small c and a small d there. So that is what we call as being candela. The luminous intensity, how much intensity of light is being produced by an object. Then the last but not the least is what we simply call as being amount of a substance. So we do have what we call as being amount of a substance. So amount of a substance is represented by the SI unit called mole, and you use small m, o, and l. So you need to know these. These are more like the foundation units from which we can actually get the other units, and hence you need to know them as being, you know, the 7 fundamental, you know, quantities that we have in physics. And throughout our discussion in our O-level physics, we are going to be using them, and you need to know the units and the correct symbol that they are going to be used. Now we can come to what we are calling as being, you know, derived quantities. What are these derived quantities? Well, derived quantities, we can simply say these are you know, quantities. So we can simply say these are, we can say that these are quantities that are obtained. In other words, these are quantities that are obtained by combining. When I use the word combining, it could either mean you are multiplying, you are dividing, you know, you are either adding, and so on and so forth, probably subtracting, whatever it may indicate there. So these are obtained by combining or using mathematical operators. So these are quantities that are obtained by combining, you know, 2 or more, you know, basic quantities. So quantities that you can obtain by combining 2 or more basic quantities, these are what we call as being derived quantities. I hope we are together. Let me just give you so that you are able to see there are a lot of these you know, derived quantities that we do have in our physics. I just want to show you, for example, when we talk about you remember area. If you're talking about the area is equal to length multiplied by, you know, the breadth. That's what we know, L times B as we call it. Length is simply a fundamental quantity. Breadth is also, you know, a fundamental quantity, because you are still talking about the same thing as being length. Volume, L times B times H, all these are fundamental units. So you have combined them to obtain V, the volume, which is you know, a derived quantity. You can also talk about what we are calling as being velocity. For example, when we talk about velocity, velocity is equal to the change of displacement. Yeah, don't worry, you are going to understand displacement over time, which we simply say as being S over T. All these are simply basic, then they give you a derived unit. You can simply talk about what we are calling as being work, you know. Yeah, you can simply talk about work. So there are so many, you know, derived you know, quantities that we do have that we can talk about. As you go on, you are actually going to learn about a lot of these derived quantities. Acceleration, we can talk about acceleration. We can simply talk about velocity. But of course, we do not just need to know these, we also need to know the SI unit that we are going to be using. So in my next discussion, I'll give you a table that summarizes this. Thank you so much for watching my video. Watch out for more information.